Which college you are studying law, Tiara? Have you learned the basic manners how to sit in the court? Don't sit here and drink water or drink coffee. It is not a cafeteria. If you want to drink water, you go out and drink water. You cannot just open your bottle and start drinking water in the courtroom.
You are reading in Hindi. Do you think that I will understand? I am not able to understand. हुजूर यही तो रोना है, हम भी अंग्रेजी नहीं समझ रहे हैं.
Every Indian family has a horror story.
How much money have you paid?
You can blame socialism, bureaucracy, or corruption. All of them matter. The Supreme Court alone has around 69,000 cases on its docket. So what did they find in India? India should be rich. Its people clearly have the talent. Indians abroad run Google, Microsoft, Adobe, and hundreds of billion-dollar startups. At home, the political system has remained remarkably stable since independence. The world's largest democracy has avoided coups, civil wars, or complete institutional collapse. And yet, India remains a developing country, not a developed one. Its growth is promising, but it never quite explodes. You can blame socialism, bureaucracy, or corruption. All of them matter. But beneath these surface causes lies a quieter force, a slow, invisible suffocation of enterprise and trust. The real bottleneck to India's prosperity may not lie in its factories or banks, but in its courts.
How much money have you paid?
My lord?
How much money have you paid to the Pradhan?
No, my lord.
No money?
Ex-Pradhan.
Ex-Pradhan. How much have you paid?
Justice delayed in India is not only justice denied, it's growth denied. The numbers behind the nightmare. Let's start with the scale of dysfunction. India has at least 50 million court cases pending. Nobody knows the exact number because the system cannot even count them properly. The Supreme Court alone has around 69,000 cases on its docket. Of these, 18,000 have been pending for more than 30 years. Every Indian family has a horror story. A friend once told me about his father, a mid-career banker named in a lawsuit decades ago. Every few years, a court summons would arrive. His father would go, wait, and return home. My friend is now 40. His father has retired. The suit continues. In 2018, the Indian government estimated at the current pace, it would take 324 years to clear the backlog. Since then, the number of pending cases has doubled. The judicial manpower is pitiful. India has 21 judges per million people, up from 10 in 2002, an improvement, but still laughingly low compared to the EU average of 200 and the US average of 150. For context, when Denmark worried that a shortage of judges, roughly 100 per million, might endanger the rule of law, one could only laugh grimly. If that's a crisis, then India's rule of law has been extended for decades. As for timeframes, a civil suit in a high court takes on average 5 years. In the Supreme Court, the average is 13 years. Every day, 40,000 new cases are filed, far more than the system can possibly absorb. Roughly two-thirds of all civil cases, roughly 66%, are land disputes, competing claims to who owns what. And here's the kicker. At this rate, even if no new cases were filed, it would take centuries to catch up. Let us understand how slow courts distort the economy. When courts fail to deliver timely justice, people adapt to not always for the better. The result is an economy built on defensive strategies rather than productive growth. The rise of family firms. In the late 2000s, a team of economists, Boehm, Eifert, Mahajan, McKenzie, and Roberts, conducted a randomized trial on textile factories in and around Mumbai. They wanted to understand why Indian firms lag in productivity. Prior work by Boehm and Van Reenen in the West had shown that family-run firms, especially those led by eldest sons, tended to perform worse than professionally managed ones. So what did they find in India? Of the 126 firms they surveyed, covering virtually the entire industrial cluster, every single one was family-run. As they wrote, these firms are also complex organizations with a median of 2 plants per firm, plus a head office in Mumbai, and 4 reporting levels from the shop floor to the managing director. In all firms, the managing director was the largest shareholder, and all directors were family members. 2 firms were publicly quoted on the Mumbai Stock Exchange, although more than 50% of the equity in each was held by managing family. The strongest predictor of firm size wasn't revenue, profit, or efficiency, but it was the number of male family members. When some firms were randomly given basic management training, their annual profits rose 17%, roughly $300,000 per year. The interventions were trivial: keep inventory logs, schedule equipment repairs, use performance charts. So why hadn't they done this before? Because owners couldn't trust managers. Without fast, credible courts, delegation risks theft or betrayal. If a manager cheats, a lawsuit might take decades. So families hoard control, not because they love nepotism, but because the law cannot protect them if they delegate. That single bottleneck, that is, contract enforcement, keeps India's businesses small, informal, and inward looking. Misallocation and integration research by Hsieh and Klenow in 2009 showed that in India, output could rise 40% to 60% if capital and labor were simply reallocated from less productive to more productive firms. That's not hypothetical, it's what legal bottlenecks prevent. Later, Boehm and Oberfield in 2020 drilled down further. Using the age of each state's high court as a measure of backlog, they found that slower courts force firms to become more vertically integrated, doing everything themselves because suppliers can't be trusted. They estimate that if all courts were as efficient as the best ones, productivity would rise 4% to 7% nationwide. The Bharat Forge case. The cost of firing one man. Consider the case of Bharat Forge Company Limited versus Uttam Manohar Nakate. A worker, Mr. Nakate, was caught sleeping on duty not once, but 4 times. He was dismissed in 1983 after due process. He sued. The local court ordered his reinstatement at half pay. The company appealed. The case reached the Supreme Court, which in 2005, 22 years later, finally ruled that Bharat Forge had been justified in firing him. By then, both worker and management had changed generations. If firing one unproductive employee requires 2 decades and 3 levels of courts, what rational firm would ever expand its payroll? When courts choke capitalism, these delays don't just inconvenience litigants. They systematically warp India's economy. Land and labor lock in because land disputes take decades. Developers avoid uncertain plots, leaving trillions in idle assets. Firms hesitate to hire because firing is nearly impossible. Workers stay underemployed in small informal firms because larger firms can't risk growing beyond 100 employees. The threshold that triggers onerous labor laws. Multinationals stay away as a result. Foreign companies lacking family control structures depend on courts to enforce contracts. If that enforcement is unreliable, they stay away, depriving the country of management know-how and technological transfer. Misallocation becomes normal. Economists call this resource misallocation. It means capital and labor aren't flowing to their most productive users. Quiet, invisible tax on growth. The net cost, at least 10% of GDP every year, according to some estimates, roughly equivalent to the lower end projections of the cost of climate change. You might ask, what is the political economy of delay? Why hasn't India fixed this? Because the judiciary itself has no incentive to expand. Judges are appointed to high courts by the president on the advice of the judiciary and to district courts by the governor, again in consultation with the high court. But the collegium system, where judges appoint other judges, meets rarely. Between 2017 and 2020, it met 12 times, 3 of which were to discuss single appointment. As of November 2023, there were 5,600 vacancies, including 2 in the Supreme Court and 364 in the high courts. With fewer judges, each judge's power increases. Why would they rush to dilute it? Add to that executive interference, the current government, and like those before it, has stalled appointments for political reasons. Vacancies drag for 8 months on average. The culture of adjournment in Indian courts are also heirs to their colonial legal culture, obsessed with procedure over resolution. Cases are adjourned endlessly. Lawyers fail to show up, judges shrug and reschedule. There are no penalties for delay. The story from the New York Times illustrates it perfectly. A man named Mr. Mahinder, accused of selling adulterated milk a decade ago, still goes to court every few months. The government inspector who filed the case was reassigned and never reappeared. Each time Mahinder's attendance is marked, the judge simply sets another date. There is absurd proclivity of judgments, and when judgments do arrive, they are comically long. Take the state versus Jayalalitha corruption case. The Supreme Court's opinion ran to 570 pages, including 552 paragraphs of dense, tortured English of a wannabe writer. Here's a sample from one supplemental opinion because apparently 570 pages weren't enough. A growing impression in contemporary existence seems to acknowledge the all-pervading pestilent presence of corruption almost in every walk of life, as if to rest reconciled to the octopoid strangehold of this malaise with helpless awe. The common day experiences indeed do introduce one to the unfailing regularity, the variegated cancerous concoctions of corruptions with fearless impunity gnawing into the frame and fabric of nations' essentia. Emboldened by the lucrative yields of such malignant materialism, the perpetrators of this malady have tightened their noose on societal psyche. Individual and collective pursuits with curative interventions at all levels are indispensable to deliver the civil order from the asphyxiating snare of this escalating venality. There is rage, tragedy, and comedy intertwined in this. But this is not jurisprudence, it's a hostage note written by a thesaurus. Resolution and road to judicial reform. India spends a meager 0.1% of its GDP on judiciary, less than it spends on fertilizer subsidies or even government advertising. When judicial infrastructure has increasing returns, once you have the fixed cost of judges, buildings, and digital systems, each additional case is cheap to process. In other words, the marginal cost of justice falls as scale rises. To unlock India's economic potential, judicial reform must be treated as a growth policy. Expand judicial capacity. Raise the ratio from 21 to 50 judges per million. Fill all vacancies immediately. Treat district judgeships like civil service posts with standardized pay and promotions. Enforce timeliness. Limit adjournments. Penalize absentee lawyers. Impose statutory deadlines for case disposal. Digitize everything. Mandate e-filing, automatic case scheduling, and digital tracking of adjournments. States like Telangana and Delhi have already cut pendency dramatically through technology. Please scale that nationally. Transparency and competition. Publish every court's median case age and clearance rate. Let the public compare districts. Specialized tribunals, fast-track courts for land, commercial, and labor disputes can relieve the general system, much like how bankruptcy tribunals, that is, National Company Law Tribunal, NCLT, reduce corporate backlogs. If these measures were enacted, research suggests GDP could rise by several percentage points, the same order of magnitude as the 1991 liberalization itself. India's problem isn't its people. It isn't even its politics. It's the institutional drag of legal uncertainty. When courts cannot guarantee justice in time, citizens hedge. Families hoard wealth instead of investing. This creates low trust society and scarcity mindset. Firms stay small instead of scaling. Workers cling to unproductive jobs instead of taking risks. Every actor behaves rationally and the economy stagnates collectively. Fixing this will not be glamorous. It won't win elections, trend on social media, but the payoff would be revolutionary. A functioning court system is the hidden infrastructure of capitalism, as essential as roads, ports, or electricity. If India can make its courts as fast as its payment apps, it would unleash one of the greatest productivity surges in modern history. Until then, every delayed verdict, every adjourned case, and every gratuitous 570-page judgment will stand as a monument not only to bureaucratic failure, but to the wealth India could have had. Because ultimately, a slow court is the most expensive bureaucracy of all.